Okay, I am going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so I am doing a live reading. First off, my name is Angel, Angel Brown, and I am the owner of Heart and Soul Studio, Heart and Soul Wellness Studio. And I have decided that I want to read this book to the collective, The Great Cosmic Mother, Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth. It's written by Monica Shue and Barbara Moore. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So the layout for the reading is going to be this. Basically, we have 50, it's about 50 chapters. So I really want to get through this book in a decent amount of time. So the plan is to read maybe an hour, 40 minutes. Um, yeah, pretty much an hour and 40 minutes. While you guys can stay on mute. You can keep your videos off if you'd like. You can treat this like an audio book pretty much. So you can do whatever you need to do as long as you're listening in. If the goal is to listen and get this in, you can read on your own later, however you want to do it. So, the plan again is to read for about an hour and 40 minutes, and then we can either drop off if you have any questions or comments at that time. Then we can discuss for a little bit. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started then. I wanted to, before I get started, just show you this painting by one of the authors. This is what I wanted to show you. And the name of the painting is God Giving Birth. Got to say, this book was written in 1987, and you are going to be amazed by its relevance to today. But this painting was also, I think, this painting was also, painted back in the 80s. And the author, I believe it was Barbara who painted this. The author stated that she had so much backlash for this painting and the title because it was God giving birth. Some had even called it blasphemy. 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 So the name of the chapter is The First Sex. In the beginning, we were all created female. Okay. In the beginning was a very female sea. For 2.5 billion years on Earth, all life forms floated in the womb-like environment of the planetary ocean, nourished and protected by its fluid chemicals, rocked by the lunar tidal rhythms. Charles Darwin believed the menstrual cycle originated here, organically or echoing the moon pulse of the sea. And because this longest period of life's time on Earth was dominated by marine forms, reproducing parthenogenetically, he concluded that the female principle was primordial. In the beginning, life did not gestate within the body of any creature, but within the ocean womb containing all organic life. There were no specialized sex organs. Rather, a generalized female existence reproduced itself within the female body of the sea. Before more complex life forms could develop and move onto land, it was necessary to miniaturize the oceanic environment, to reproduce it on a small and mobile scale. Soft, moist eggs deposited on dry ground and exposed to air would die. Life could not move beyond the water-hugging amphibian stage. In the course of evolution, the ocean, the protective and nourishing space, the amniotic fluids, even the lunar tidal rhythm was transferred into the individual female body, and the penis, a mechanical device for land reproduction, evolved. The penis first appeared in the age of the reptiles, about 200 million years ago. Our archetypal association of the snake with the phallus contains, no doubt, this genetic memory. This is a fundamental and recurring pattern in nature. Life is a female environment in which the male appears, often periodically, and created by the female to perform highly specialized tasks related to species reproduction and a more complex evolution. Daphnia, a freshwater crustacean, reproduces several generations of females by parthenogenesis. By parthenogenesis. The egg and its own polar body mate to form a complete set of genes for a female offspring. Once annually, at the end of the year's cycle, a short-lived male group is produced. The males specialize in manufacturing leathery egg cases able to survive the winter. Among honeybees, the drone group is produced and regulated by the sterile daughter workers and the fertile queen. Drones exist to mate with the queen. An average of 7 drones per hive accomplish this act each season, and then the entire male group is destroyed by the workers. Among whiptail lizards in the American Southwest, 4 species are parthenogenetic. Males are unknown among the desert grassland plateau and Chihuahua whiptails and have been found only rarely among the checkered whiptails. Okay. Among mammals, even among humans, parthenogenesis, parthenogenesis is not technically impossible. Every female egg contains a polar body with a complete set of chromosomes. The polar body and the egg, if united, could form a daughter embryo. In fact, ovarian cysts are unfertilized eggs that have joined with their polar bodies, been implanted in the ovarian wall, and started to develop there. This is not to say that males are an unnecessary sex, right? Parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis. I get that. Parthenogenesis is a cloning process. Sexual reproduction, which enhances the variety and health of the gene pool, is necessary for the kind of complex evolution that has produced the human species. The point being made here is simply that when it comes to the two sexes, one of us has been around a lot longer than the other. In The Nature and Evolution of Female Sexuality, it's a book written by Mary Jane Sherfay, MD. She described her discovery in 1961 of something called the inductor theory. The inductor theory stated that all mammalian embryos, male and female, are anatomically female during the early stages of fetal life. Sherfay wondered why this theory had been buried in the medical literature since 1951, completely ignored by the profession. The men who made this her story making discovery, not his story, the men who made this her story making discovery simply didn't want it to be true. Sherfay pioneered the discussion of the inductor theory, and now, with modifications based on further data, its findings are accepted as facts of mammalian, including human, development. As Stephen Jay Gould describes it, the embryo in its first 8 weeks is an indifferent creature with bisexual potential. In the 8th week, if a Y chromosome bearing sperm fuses with the egg, the gonads will develop into testes, which secrete androgen, which in turn induces male genitalia to form or develop. In the absence of androgen, the embryo develops into a female. There is a difference in the development of the internal and external genitalia, however. For the internal genitalia, the fallopian tubes and ovaries, or the sperm carrying ducts, the early embryo contains precursors of both sexes. In the presence or absence of androgen, as one set develops, the other degenerates. With the external genitalia, the different organs of male and female develop along diverging lines from the same precursor. This means, in effect, that the clitoris and the penis are the same organ, formed from the same tissue. The labia majora and the scrotum are one, indistinguishable in the early embryonic stages. In the presence of androgen, the two lips simply grow longer, fold over, and fuse along the midline, forming the scrotal sac. God. Gould concludes the female course of development is, in a sense, biologically intrinsic to all mammals. It is the pattern that unfolds in the absence of any hormonal influence. The male route is a modification induced by secretion of androgens from the developing testes. The vulnerability of the male newcomer within the female environment is well known. Vaginal secretions are more destructive to the Y-bearing sperm. The mortality rate is higher among neonate and infant males. Within the womb, the male fetus for the first 2 months is protected by being virtually indistinguishable from a female. After that, it must produce large amounts of the masculinizing hormone in order to define itself as male, to achieve and to maintain its sexual identity. For all we know, the Near Eastern myths upon which our Western mythologies are built, those which portray the young god or hero battling against a female dragon, have some analog here in utero, where the male fetus wages a kind of chemical war against re-becoming female. For now, it is enough to say that maleness among mammals is not a primary state, but differentiates from the original female biochemistry and anatomy. The original libido of warm-blooded animals is female, and the male or maleness is a derivation from this primary female pattern. Why then did the medical men, the scientists, take longer to figure out this basic biological fact than it took them to split the atom? And why, once this fact was noted, did they turn around and bury it in professional silence for 10 years until a woman dug it up again? Why, indeed? For about 2,000 years of Western history, female sexuality was denied. When it could not be denied, it was condemned as evil. Hold on, guys. I want to make sure. Uh, okay. Okay, so I'm sorry about that. For about 2,000 years of Western history, female sexuality was denied. When it could not be denied, it was condemned as evil. The female was seen as divinely designed to be a passive vessel serving reproductive purposes only. In one not too ancient dictionary, clitoris was defined as a rudimentary organ, while masculinity equaled the cosmic generative force. With Freud, female sexuality was not so much rediscovered as pathologized. Freud dismissed the clitoris as an undeveloped masculine organ and defined original libido as male. Clitoral eroticism was reduced to a perverse neurosis. Even after Masters and Johnson's laboratory studies were published in Human Sexual Response, that's the name of the book, in 1966, their findings were not integrated into psychoanalytical theory. In Mary Jane Sherfay's research during that period, she found not one work of comparative anatomy that described or even mentioned the deeper lying clitoral structures. Yet, every other structure of the human body was described in living detail. Even today, with our relative sophistication of 1987, even today, with our relative sophistication of 1987, we are frequently whistled at by magazine headlines that promise breathless articles announcing the discovery of a new spot, a G spot, an X spot located within the vagina. Within all these new spots exists the old wistful desire to deny the existence of the clitoris as a trigger organ of female orgasm. Why? There is the generalized traditional fear of female sexuality. Further, there is discomfort with the similarity with the common origin of the female clitoris and the male penis. Women are used to hearing the clitoris described as an undeveloped penis. Men are not used to thinking of the penis as an overdeveloped clitoris. Finally, and most seriously, there is a profound psychological and institutional reluctance to face the repercussions of the fact that the female clitoris is the only organ in the human body whose purpose is exclusively that of erotic stimulation and release. What does this mean? It means that for the human female alone, among all Earth's life's forms, sexuality and reproduction are not inseparable. It is the male penis, carrier of both semen and sexual response, that is simultaneously procreative and erotic. If we wanted to reduce one of the sexes to a purely reproductive function on the basis of its anatomy, which we don't, but it would be the male sex that qualified for such a reduction, not the female, not the human female. But these are only biological facts. These are only biological realities. As we know, facts and realities can be and are systematically ignored in the service of established ideologies. Guys, these are biological facts and biological realities. Let's keep that in mind, okay? Throughout the world today, virtually all religious, cultural, economic, and political institutions stand where they were built centuries ago on the solid foundation of an erroneous concept, a concept that assumes the psychic passivity, the creative inferiority, and the sexual secondariness of women. This enshrined concept states that men exist to create the human world while women exist to reproduce humans. Period. If we argue that data exists, not solely biological, but archaeological, mythological, anthropological, and historical data, which, period, and historical data, which refutes the universality of this erroneous concept, we are told to shut up because something called God supports the erroneous concept. And that's all that matters. That's the final word. Mm. Throughout the world, throughout what we know of history, something called God has been used to support the denial, the condemnation, and the mutilation of female sexuality, of the female sex ourselves. Today, in parts of Africa, predominantly among African Muslims, but also among African Christians and Jews, and some tribal beliefs, young girls are still subjected to clitoridectomy. This surgery, often performed by older women with broken glass or knives, excises the clitoris, severing the nerves of orgasm. The operation is intended to force the girl to concentrate on her vagina as a reproductive vessel. Infibulation, a more thorough operation, removes the labia minora, and much of the labia majora. The girl is then closed up with thorns or required to lie with her legs tied together until her entire vaginal orifice is fused shut. Yes, this is still going on today, Dr. B. With a straw inserted to allow passage of urine and menstrual blood. On the wedding night, the young woman is slit open by a midwife or her husband. Further cutting and reclosing is performed before and after childbirth. Complications from these surgeries are numerous, including death from infection, hemorrhage, inability to urinate, scar tissue preventing dilation during labor, painful coitus, and infertility due to chronic pelvic infection. In 1976, an estimated 10 million women were involved with this operation, and something called God justified it. A God who supposedly created young girls as filthy sex maniacs who must then be mutilated to turn them into docile breeders. the, the word infibulation comes from the Latin fibula, meaning a clasp. Those civilized Romans, great highway builders, also invented the technology of fastening metal clasps through the prepuces of young girls to enforce chastity. This practice was copied by Christian crusaders during the early Middle Ages in Europe. They locked up their wives and daughters in metal chastity belts and then took the keys with them while they were gone, often for many years, fighting for God in the Near East. Unless through hypocrisy and racism we dismiss these practices as merely barbaric or ancient, we must recall that clitoridectomies were performed in the last century on young girls and women in both Europe and America. And just like Dr. B just said, it's still going on today. This surgery, very popular with 19th century Victorians, was inflicted on any female considered to be oversexed or as a punishment for masturbation or as a cure for madness. These determinations were all made by male relatives, male physicians, and male clerics, and the women involved had no legal say in the matter. These are extreme examples of the repression and mutilation of female sexuality, always sanctioned, however, remotely and dishonestly, by something called God. All the other repressions and mutilations of the body, of the mind, of the soul, of our experienced female selves are so well known and documented that they need no numeration at this point. We can all make our own lists. The point is this: wherever repression of female sexuality and of the female sex exists, and at the present writing, this is everywhere on earth. We find the same underlying assumptions. These are ontological assumptions made at the very root of things about the nature of life itself. They are one, that the world was created by a male deity figure or God. Two, that existing world orders or cultures were made by and for men with God's sanction. Three, that females are an auxiliary sex who exist to serve and populate these male world orders. Four, that autonomous female sexuality poses a wild and lethal threat to these world orders and therefore must be controlled and repressed. And finally, five, that God's existence as a male sanctions this repression. The perfect circularity or tautology of these assumptions only helps to bind them more securely around the human psyche. That they are as erroneous as they are universal seems to pose no problem to their upholders. After all, wherever we go on earth, every intact institution, religious, legal, government, economic, military, communications, and customs, is built on the solid slab of these assumptions. And that's a pretty entrenched error. In the post World War II United States, as well as in Europe and most of the world generally, we've gone through a secularizing period in which some of these assumptions have been loosened up and even been made to crumble under questioning. But now the backlash is upon us. Today, spokespeople for various fundamentalist religious beliefs use modern media to broadcast a very old idea that female sexuality, i.e., feminists and feminist demands for abortion, contraception, reproductive autonomy, childcare, equal pay, psychological integrity, constitutes a threat to our civilization. And this amounts to a blasphemy against God. Whores of Babylon, Darwin's theory of evolution, and the menace of world communism all somehow get subliminally mixed up in this feminist threat. For some very good historic and psychological reasons, which we will explore later. For now, it is enough to say that God and civilization are loaded concepts, loaded with dynamite that can always be brought into and an argument that cannot otherwise be refuted. Or for those who don't lean too heavily on God or who major in civilization, you can always quote an anthropologist. For just as established religions assume the maleness of God, just as fraud and psychoanalysis assume the maleness of libido, so have the social sciences, and in particular anthropology, assumed the generic maleness of human evolution. Both popular and academic anthropological writers have presented us with scenarios of human evolution that feature almost exclusively the adventures and inventions of man the hunter, man the toolmaker, man the territorial marker, and so forth. Woman is not comprehended as an evolutionary or evolutionizing creature. She is treated rather as an auxiliary to a male dominated evolutionary process. She mothers him, she mates him, she cooks his dinner, she follows around after him picking up his loose rocks. He evolves, she follows. He evolutionizes, she adjusts. If the book, yeah, if the book jackets don't give us pictures of female Homo sapiens being dragged by their hair through 2 or 3 million years of he man evolution, we are left to assume this was the situation. This, despite the known fact that among contemporary and historic hunting and gathering people, as among our remote hunting and gathering ancestors, 75% to 80% of the group's subsistence comes from the women's food gathering activities. This, despite the known fact that the oldest tools used by contemporary hunters and gatherers and the oldest, most primal tools ever found in ancient sites are women's digging sticks. This, despite worldwide legends that cite women as the first users and domesticators of fire. This, despite the known fact that women were the first potters, the first weavers, the first textile dyers, and hide tanners, the first to gather and study medicinal plants, i.e., the first doctors, and on and on. Observing the linguistic interplay between mothers and infants, mothers and children, and among work groups of women, it is easy to speculate on the female contribution to the origin and elaboration of language. Hello. That the first time measurements ever made, the first formal calendars were women's lunar markings. The first time measurements ever made, the first formal calendars were women's lunar markings on painted pebbles and carved sticks is also known. And it is thoroughly known that the only God image ever painted on rock, carved in stone, or sculpted in clay from the upper Paleolithic to the middle Neolithic, and that's roughly 30,000 years, was the image of a human female. I hope y'all caught that. In 1948, The Gate of Horn was republished in Britain. In 1963, it was published in America, retitled Religious Conceptions of the Stone Age. In this pioneering work, archaeologist and scholar G. Rachel Levy showed the unbroken continuity of religious images and ideas descending from the Cro Magnon peoples of the Upper Paleolithic period in Ice Age Europe through the Mesolithic and Neolithic developments in the Near East and down to our own historical time. As Levy noted, these early people are lost to us in the mist of time, but their primal visions, images, and just thoughts of human experience on this planet still resonate in our psyches, as well as in the historic religious ontological symbols. These early Stone Age people bequeath to all humanity a foundation of ideas upon which the mind could raise its structures. And what were these primal images and ideas? The cave as the female womb, the mother as a pregnant earth, the magical fertile female as the mother of all animals. The Venus of Lausa, standing with the horn of the moon upraised in her hand. The cave as the female tomb where life is buried, painted blood red and awaiting rebirth. Levy shows the continuity of these images and symbols through the late Neolithic Near Eastern rites and mythologies and their endurance 30,000 years later in modern religions. In Christianity, for example, with its central image of the birth of the sacred child in a cave like shelter surrounded by magical animals, and especially in Catholicism, the icon of the Great Mother who stands on the horned moon and awaits the rebirth of the world. The evidence leaves no doubt that these images were at the origins of what we all call human psychological and spiritual expression. Let me say that again. The evidence leaves no doubt that these images were at the origins of what we call human psychological and spiritual expression. Levy's book is a masterpiece. It received great praise upon both its British and American publications and has since been virtually bypassed and ignored by the anthropological, archaeological, academic establishments. Why? Because her evidence is irrefutable. It shows with clarity and in the solidity of stone and bone that the first 30,000 years of Homo sapiens existence was dominated by a celebration of the female processes, of the mysteries of menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth, of the analogous abundance of the earth, of the seasonal movement of animals, and the cycles of time in the great round of the mother. The gate of horn is as close as we can come to reading the sacred book of our early human ancestors. And it confirms what too many people do not want to know, that the first God was female. Since Levy wrote, the tendency has been to relegate these old Stone Age and Neolithic images to the psychological realm. They've become archetypes of the unconscious and so forth, while anthropological writers, proper, both academic and popular, continue to explain physical, real human development solely in terms of the experiences of the male body in hunting, aggression, and tool making. Thus, the female images, which are there and cannot be denied, are sideswiped, reduced to the subjective, the mythic realms, and thus the first 30,000 years of our human history is denied to us, relegated to a mind trip or psychological software. Even among feminists in recent years, there has risen doubt that these images and symbols might be anything but mythology, unrealities. To approach our human past and the female god, we need a wagon with at least two wheels. One is the mythical, historical, archaeological. The other is the biological, anthropological. A strong track has already been laid down for the mythical, historical, archaeological wheel. Milestones along that track, along with G. Rachel Levy's great work, are J.J. Pachofin's Myth, Religion, and Mother Right. That's a book. Robert Briffault's The Mothers. Helen Diner's Mothers and Amazons, Jesse Weston's From Ritual to Romance, Robert Graves' The White Goddess, O.G.S. Crawford's The Eye Goddess, Sybil Kless Readin's, the name of the book is In the Realm of the Great Goddess, Michael Dane's Silbury Treasure and Avebury Cycle, Marija Gambuta's The Goddesses and the Gods of Old Europe, and most recently, Elizabeth Davis's The First Sex. Merlin Stone's When God Was a Woman, and Ancient Warriors of Womanhood. I'm sorry, Ancient Mirrors of Womanhood. Phyllis Chesler's Women in Madness and About Men. Adrienne Rich's Of Woman Born. Mary Daly's Beyond God the Father, Gynecology, and Pure Lust. Susan Griffin's Woman and Nature, Anne Cameron's Daughters of Copper Woman, and many, many more, including the richly useful Women's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets by Barbara G. Walker. So these are all the books that have been written about the Great Mother. The other side of our wagon, the biological, anthropological side, has almost no wheel and no track, not because there is no important place to go in that direction, but because the physical cultural anthropologists are off somewhere busily mapping the evolution of Tarzan. There is no body of anthropological work based on the evolution of female biology, with rare exceptions. There have been no attempts whatsoever to study the evolution of human physiology and cultural organization from pre hominid to modern man from the perspective of the definitive changes undergone by the female in the process of that evolution. Popular books on this subject by Lionel Tiger, Desmond Morris et al. Are invariably male oriented, treating the evolution of the female as sex object only, from monkey and heat to hot bunny. One delightful exception is Elaine Morgan's The Descent of Woman. During 12 million years of dry Pliocene, Morgan speculates the female pre-hominid took to the oceans, surviving in the warm and food-filled coastal waters, and during this experience underwent a sea change from knuckle-walking, rear-sex primate to upright human sexual body, to which the male primate responded by becoming man. Morgan argues convincingly that the human species survived the long Pliocene drought through the cooperation and social invention of the evolving hominid females in their adaptation to the sea. Academic experts ignore this theory, but they have no other explanation for our Pliocene survival, for our successful evolution from ape to human during this difficult period, or for the many ways in which our human bodies resemble the bodies of sea mammals rather than primates. In the time falling bodies take to light, it's another book. Historian William Irwin Thompson points out that early human evolution occurred in three critical stages: hominization, in which our primate bodies became human, not only in walking upright and freeing the hands, but specifically in sexual characteristics and functions. Symbolization, in which we begin using speech, marking time, painting and sculpting images, and agriculturalization, in which we domesticated seeds and began control of food production. And as Thomas writes, all three stages were initiated and developed by the human female. The symbol making and agricultural stages have been studied, and the originating role of women in these stages is known. It is sexual hominization which, as yet, has barely been explored. Why? Why indeed? Because sexual hominization is almost exclusively the story of the human female. The mechanics and anatomy of male sexuality, after all, haven't changed greatly since the primates made love. The revolution in human sexuality, the revolution that made us human, resulted from evolutionary changes that occurred in the female body. These changes were not primarily related to mammalian reproduction, but to human sexual relationship. No one knows the order in which they occurred, but taken together as an evolved cluster of sexual characteristics, they constitute a truly radical sexual metamorphosis undergone by the human female. And some of this sexual metamorphosis is now listed. One being elimination of the estrous cycle and development of the menstrual cycle. This meant that women were not periodically in heat, but capable of sexual activity at any time. Pregnancy could occur during a part of the cycle, but for most of the cycle, sex could happen without necessarily resulting in pregnancy. Among all other animals, the estrus cycle determines that copulation always results in pregnancy and has no other than among all other animals, the estrus cycle determines that copulation always results in pregnancy and has no other than a reproductive purpose. The second thing, the radical sexual metamorphosis has undergone. The second thing that is that that's been undergoing within the human female is the development of the clitoris and evolution of the vagina. This meant a greatly enhanced sexuality and orgasmic potential in human females compared to other animals. The next one is the change from rear to frontal sex. We can imagine created an enormous, okay, so let me say that again. The change from rear to frontal sex, we can imagine, created an enormous change in relations between the sexes. Frontal sex means a prolonged and enhanced lovemaking period, and what might be called the personalization of sex. The emotion evoking role of face to face intercourse in the development of human self consciousness has yet to be evaluated. She turned around and looked him in the eye, and there was light. Development of breasts added to women's potential for sexual arousal. Further, combined with frontal sex, no doubt the female's maternal and social feelings were also now aroused by the personal lover, whose body was now analogous to the infant's body at her breast. As Thompson points out, such radical changes in the female body alone were enough to trigger the hominization of the species. Human beings with these changes became the only creatures on earth for whom copulation can occur anytime for non reproductive purposes. Okay? Let me say, as Thompson points out, such radical changes in the female body alone were enough to trigger the hominization of the species. Human beings with these changes became the only creatures on earth for whom copulation occurs and can occur anytime for non reproductive purposes. Human sex thus became a multi purpose activity. It can happen for emotional bonding, for social bonding, for pleasure, for communication, for shelter and comfort, for personal release, for escape, as well as for reproduction of the species. And this is one of the original and major determining differences between humans and all other animals, birds, reptiles, insects, fishes, worms, for whom copulation exists only and solely for the species reproduction. The human race has been definitively shaped by the evolution revolution of the female the human race has been definitively shaped by the evolution revolution of the female body into a capacity for non reproductive sex. This is not just a physical fact, it is a cultural, religious, and political fact of primary significance. Many feminists today are unsure whether studies of evolutionary biology or of religious mythology can have political relevance for contemporary women. We believe that nothing could be more politically relevant than knowing why we got where we are now by seeing how we got here and where we began. In the beginning, the first environment for all new life was female. In the beginning, the first environment for all new life was female. That's fact. The physical, emotional, spiritual body of the mother and the communal body of women, young girls, grown women, older women, working together. Let me say that all in one sentence. In the beginning, the first environment for all new life was female. The physical, emotional, spiritual body of the mother and the communal body of women, young girls, grown women, older women working together. When hunting and gathering people move, the infant is carried, bound close to the mother's body. When they settle, the women form an inner circle, campsite of women and children. The socialization process begins here. Human culture is marked by a strengthening and prolongation of the relation between mothers and offspring. For its first year, the human child is virtually an embryo outside the womb, extremely vulnerable and totally dependent. Female group behavior, the cooperative care sharing among mothers and children, older and younger women in the task of daily life emerges from the fact of this prolonged dependence of the human child on the human female for its survival. Males help, but they also leave. The male body comes and goes, but the female presence is constant. Females train, discipline, and protect the young. Beyond infant care, the maintenance and leadership of the entire kin group is the task of women. The female animal is always on the alert, for on her rests the responsibility of not only feeding the young, but of keeping the young from being food for others. She is the giver and also the sustainer of beginning life. Among humans, males help with protection and food acquisition, but it is the communal group of females that surrounds the child in its first 4 to 6 years of life with a strong physical, emotional, traditional, and linguistic presence. And this is the foundation of social life and human culture. The popular image of early human the popular image of early human society as being dominated, indeed created, by sexist male hunters and ferocious territorial headbangers just doesn't hold water. If the first humans had depended solely on despotic and aggressive male leaders, or on several males in chronic ritualistic contention for power, human society would never have developed. Human culture could never have been invented. The human presence on earth would never have evolved. The fact is that it was from this first inner circle of women, the campsite, the fireside, the cave, the first hearth, the first hearth, the first circle of birth, that human society evolved. As hominids evolved into as hominids evolved into Paleolithic Homo sapiens and then into settled and complex Neolithic village people on the time edge of civilization, these tens of thousands of years of human culture were shaped and sustained by communities of creative, sexually, and psychically active women. Women who were inventors, producers, scientists, physicians, lawgivers, visionary shamans, artists. Women who were also the mothers, receivers, and transmitters of terrestrial and cosmic energy. We have to understand how and why these ancient millennia of woman cultures have been buried, ignored, denied, passed off as mythology or primitive prehistoric origins by Western male historians who insist and often really believe that real history began only about 5,000 years ago with the relatively recent institutions of patriarchy. No, 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 no. Okay, guys, let's see. It's 9:23 and we're on to the next chapter. So this is lining up perfect. We'll do one more chapter and then wrap it up with a little bit of discussion if we have time, if you feel up to it. Okay. Next chapter is Marx and the Matriarchy. Ancient woman-oriented groupings were the original communism. Friedrich Frederick Engels and Karl Marx recognized this. Engels especially refers to the mother right concepts of J.J. Bachofen. Okay. Sorry, guys. I had to get some water. Of J.J. Pachofin, and both men based their analysis of social development on the primary existence of ancient matriarchies, communal matrifocal systems. In this, they were influenced by the writings of Lewis Morgan, an American anthropologist. Morgan lived with and studied the tribal society of the Iroquois. In their kinship structure, language, and customs, he found evidence of early communal, and blood relationships based on different stages of group marriage. In Ancient Society, written in the 1880s, Morgan offered his conclusion that such a society was matrilinear and matrifocal of necessity, since within a group marriage structure, only the mother can be definitely known as the parent of a child. We now know that similar evidence can be found all over the world. For example, many kinship systems distinguish between the biological father of a child and the social father, who is usually the mother's brother or other male relative. The social father is considered the real father in these societies. Identity and inheritance are passed along through the female bloodlines. But pioneers that they were, neither Morgan, Ingalls, nor Marx were fully aware of women's real functions and achievements in past cultures. Nor were they turned in, nor were they tuned in to the total gestalt of early peoples. With Marx and Engels, and in particular with their dogmatic interpreters and followers, a narrowing of focus to strictly economic and class analysis has totally obscured the original human state of being, which was more profoundly spiritual than economic. This Marxist narrowing of focus and its consequent denial of human spiritual experience has had tragic repercussions throughout the world. How did this happen? Karl Marx, Engels as well, was a deeply compassionate man. His opium of the people statement, which is never fairly quoted, is evidence of this. And here's the statement: religious distress is at the same time the expression of real distress and the protest against real distress. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, just as it is the spirit of a spiritless situation. It is the opium of the people. The demand to give up the illusions about its conditions is the demand to give up a condition that needs illusions. Criticism has plucked the imagery flowers from the chain, not so that men will wear the chain without any fantasy or consolation, but so that they will break the chain and call the living flower. No one has said it better or more clearly recognized the human being's absolute right to cling to spirit in a spiritless situation and to heart in a heartless world, because spirit and heart are real. And they alone have helped millions of human beings survive in an otherwise unsurvivable situations. The tragedy of Marx and of Marxists was to confuse spirit with established religions. They saw clearly and historically that established religion aligned itself with the oppressing class, the oppressing monarchy, the oppressing social and economic systems. They saw the seeds of oppression in religious doctrines, doctrines that rationalized poverty and enslavement and excused brutal tyranny and greed by setting God's seal on social systems based on hierarchies of hierarchies of rich and poor, hierarchies of rulers and the ruled. They saw the wealth and power of the churches and the wretched passivity of the believers. They saw that the church was, in fact, a very man made institution that gained and retained power by exploiting the reality of the spirit versus the reality of physical need. They heard sermons condemning material wealth and earthly pleasures, while the churchmen and their rich supporters lived in opulent security. They saw No, I'm not going to start from there. I'm going to start from here, though. They heard sermons condemning material wealth and earthly pleasures, while the churchmen and their rich supporters lived in opulent security, and the mass of believers lived on their stony knees in rags. And they heard these conditions justified as God's plan for man. They saw that religious establishments take it upon themselves to define spirit and God and human destiny, always in their own elitist terms and only to their own worldly advantage. Yes, reminiscent of today's mega churches, Dr. B. Yes. Again, even though this book was written in 87, I see that to me, it's definitely relevant for today's age. Seeing these things, Marxists rightly condemned the collusion of established religions in the historic oppression of human beings. Tragically, they also denied the reality of the human spirit and its genuine longings. They rightly wanted to save humanity from religious exploitation, but in their narrowing of focus, their economic and class reductiveness, they split the human being into two conflicting parts: material existence versus spiritual existence. This split was just the mirror image of the already existing religious dualism. As dogmatic Marxist communism unfolded in country after country, this split enforced the same alienation of the human condition that Marx had wanted to resolve. It has created the dreary state capitalism of Soviet Russia and its satellites, in which the state works dourly and mechanically to enforce its definition of human life as spiritless mechanism. It has given fuel to the propaganda engines of the reactionary systems in all countries, so that the world is ripped apart in a false dichotomy between godless communism and divine capitalism. For if communism is atheistic, its opponents can claim to be mandated by God, however phony this claim might be. Finally, it has turned away untold millions of oppressed human beings who need the economic and social analysis of Marxism to clarify and change their situations, but who fear they are being asked to buy this analysis at the price of their living souls. No matter how corrupt and collusive the established religions of the world are known to be, they still stand there, offering themselves as the only sanctuaries of spirit in a spiritless world. Marxism stands, unfortunately, in the perception of too many people as a total fanatical repudiation of spiritual reality. And this perception of Marxism has helped to fuel the equally fanatic revivals of fundamentalist religions throughout the world today. Marx and Engels confuse spirit with established religion, as their doctrinaire followers continue to do. Because, as Western white males, they could not see the total paradigm of ancient women's original communism. So just catch your wait a minute. Marx and Engels confused spirit with established religion, as their doctrinaire followers continue to do, because, as Western white males, they could not see the total paradigm of ancient women's original communism. Coming from this linear, fragmenting, and reductive Western tradition, which has historic roots in the Judeo Christian Bible as well as in Aristotle Platonic, the Aristotle. um, it was from Aristotle and Plato in the Greco Roman hyper-rationality. They could not comprehend the primal holism of human experience on earth. As a result, Marxism tends to reinforce rather than oppose Western capitalism's notorious strategy of alienation. Marxist analysts generally are obsessed with isolating economic productive development from magical religious sexual development. As Paul Carden, who was a libertarian thinker, writes, here is Paul's quote: there is the Marxist assumption that throughout history, yes, there is the Marxist assumption that throughout history, Human societies have always aimed first and foremost to increase production and consumption. But the human being doesn't at birth bear within itself the finishing meaning of her or his life. The maximization of consumption or of power or of sanctity are not tendencies inherent in the newborn child. It is the prevailing culture in which she or he will be brought up, which will teach her or him that she or he needs these things. The cultivation of maize among the Mexican tribes or the cultivation of rice in some Indonesian villages is not only a means of ensuring food. Agriculture labor is also lived as goddess and child, as worship, as festival, and as dance. And when some Marxist theoretician And when some Marxist theoretician comes along and claims that on these occasions, everything which is not directly productive labor is but mystification, illusion, or cunning of reason, it must be forcibly pointed out that he himself is a far more complete personification of patriarchy and capitalism than any mere boss could be. What he is saying is that everything that humans have done or sought to do in history was only crude prefigurations of the factory system. If the Marxist in this case was denouncing or trying to eliminate patriarchal religion founded on privilege and property and mystification of reality and functioning through the exploitation of human nature, or I'm sorry, human labor and human sexuality, that would be fine. But he is also denying what is the very truth of human existence, that the essence of the original matriarchies, the experienced unity of psychic, productive, sexual, cosmic power and activity in the egalitarian collective of women. Let me say that again. He is also then denying what is the very truth of human existence and the essence of the original matriarchies, which is the experienced unity of psychic, productive, sexual, cosmic power and activity in the egalitarian collective of women. For this is precisely what patriarchy sets out to do, to split material production from spiritual experience, science from magic, medicine from herbal knowledge, and psychic seasonal environment, sexuality from sacred, art from craft, astronomy from astrology, language from poetry, and to place the resultant, specialized, abstracted, and mechanistic knowledge in the hands of a privileged male elite organized into professions, hierarchies, and classes, to reduce the ecstatic dance of muscle, blood, and soul to factory assembly lines, production output schedules, and the gross national product. Patriarchy divides life into higher and lower categories labeled spirit versus nature or mind versus matter. And typically, in this alienated symbolism, the superior spirit mind is male and or white, while the inferior nature matter is female and or black. This false dualistic symbolism arises from an enforced order of male domination. With the aid of such phallic psychology, men can then go about the earth raping nature, exploiting resources and human labor, manipulating and improving her. Let me say that again. Manipulating and improving her with technological, mechanical inventions and progressive goals. In patriarchy, man separates from earth, emulating some aloof and disconnected sky god of his own creation. And this intellectual separation makes him feel free to devastate the natural world without any sense that it belongs to a common ecosystem with himself. He exploits it nature. He exploits it, totally alienated from the fact of his own continuity with it. I I see it, Dr. B. Raping the earth. I wanted to say that sentence again, and you just brought it right back. I wanted to say that again. He exploits it, the earth, totally alienated from the fact of his own continuity with it, with the earth, with nature, for the deluded profit of the few and the existential pain of the many. Patriarchy exists by destroying original holism. When it refutes or opposes the reality of human spiritual experience, Marxist communism does not resolve this destruction. It only compounds it with a different rhetoric. It gets rid of God and church only to substitute another tyranny, that of the state or the machine or the party or the production quota. It does not truly free human beings, it only changes the brand name of the chains. A truly human politics must study, a truly human politician must study the entire history of the world's religions and spiritual beliefs. It must try to return to or move toward spiritual systems that are harmonious with all visions of creative communal life. Hmm. Because this is what is missing under both of the competing world powers, a creative communal life. Again, this is what is missing under both of the competing world powers, a creative communal life. Both systems, Western capitalism and Soviet communism, are based on the denial of communal celebration. For celebration is a play of the spirit, and there is no profit in communal existence. But human evolution, human creativity is a real miracle and a cosmic fact. We need a politics. I don't get that. We need a politics that participates in this biological, spiritual adventure. Neither the God of the dollar, nor the God of the state, nor any of the alienating patriarchal gods from which they descend allow for this communal participation. Wilhelm Reich is not commonly connected with Marxism, but this is where he began. His early work as an attempt to link the Marxist economic class analysis with a psychoanalytical understanding of the significance of sexual repression in the development of a fascist patriarchal society. This attempt was mostly successful, and for it, he was excommunicated by both the European Communist Party and the Freudian psychoanalytical circles, i.e., he was on to something. Okay, in the mass psychology of fascism and other work in the 1930s, Reich chronicled the successful manipulation of the German people by Nazi ideology. On the deepest psychological and biological levels, he argued that people had already been conditioned by generations of religious and culturally directed psychosexual repression to respond obediently and to cooperate unquestioningly with sadism, tyranny, and genocide. And anti sexual religious morality, paranoid concepts, and anti sexual religious morality, paranoid concepts of blood purity, and a rigid sense of ethnic superiority had already wired the nervous system of the torturer and clenched the muscles inside the black gloves and boots. As Reich showed, predicted in fact, a hypnotic leader like Hitler does not create these conditions, he only exploits them. Fascism is not a wild, barbaric phenomena that appears suddenly and without reason in the midst of civilization. It is the result of a long conditioning process, and the institutions that do the conditioning are those of the civilization itself. One of Reich's major points was that Marxist communism and European socialism generally narrowed down to an objective focus on economic and class relationships. They were unable to anticipate, analyze, or prevent the Nazi triumph, which was a massively subjective explosion of a pathologically conditioned people into brutal expression. Guys, we are getting somewhere with this. Just go with it. Just trust me. She's going somewhere with this. Okay? Further, the syndrome of fascism was not confined to the Germans. Fascist thought and behavior is not a national aberration, but a historically ingrained feature of the psyche of all Western civilized people, a feature clearly visible in the history of Western colonialism and imperialism. Reich's political point was this: at this point in history, changing the objective economic social systems alone is not enough. Repressive behavior, sadistic power relations, competitive greed to exploit, dominate, and humiliate, and our accommodations to these insults are by now conditioned into the nervous systems of each member of our civilized societies. Both oppressors and victims are damaged by the experience. The repressive wiring of the nervous system occurs at the most intimate levels of sex and of the spirit. The recreation of the human being must occur on these levels also if we desire a truly human revolution, one that does more than just change the guard. This point is of importance to feminists who have already observed that sexist dominating male behavior can occur along the entire political spectrum from right to left. The repression, control, and exploitation of female sexuality is a major tool of patriarchy because it goes hand in hand with the exploitation of female labor. Left wing males who see no connection between labor exploitation and sexual exploitation have failed to make a total analysis, or in Reich's terms, they have failed to undergo a total revolution on the neuron level. They are still wired for oppression. Reich pointed out in the 1930s that the prevalent male sexual fantasy in a male dominated society is one of rape. And he knew that this was not a personal fantasy, but a political one with political repercussions. He was very clear on how sexual repression of women has been the most powerful patriarchal weapon in creating social victims. Females who have been weakened, made dependent, fearful, or ashamed of our own bodies, and punished for their functions. Sexual psychological prey to any predator. Such creators are easy to exploit. Such creatures are easy to exploit politically and economically. People who do not own their own sex cannot own their own labor. Unfortunately, Reich was a strict heterosexual, unsympathetic to homosexuality, and too influenced by Freudian ideas of female sexuality. And these problems have been passed along to us at the expense of his gifts. Reich missed the connections between bisexuality and psychic wholeness. But in his comprehension of the profound and intentional links between sexual repression and political repression, he was always right on target. Marx said, human power is at its own end. Reich was devoted to the liberation and enjoyment of healthy human power as the only valid political goal. Biological energy, unrepressed and undistorted, he saw as a continuum of cosmic energy, with no non organic distinctions made between the physical and the spiritual. He saw both as forms of one energy. He called it organ, manifest throughout the universe, the same in nerve cells as in stars and in human consciousness. This evolutionary energy surging through all life forms and as an energy field in space, he defined as a spiritual reality as well as a physical force. And he believed that politics included the realignment of the repressed human being with this original creative flow, i.e., Reich was no mechanistic ideologue, but a political mystic. Therefore, he was banished from the Communist Party and psychoanalytical professional circles in Europe. He had to flee Nazi Germany. He ended up in the United States with his books destroyed by the federal government and his work outlawed, and he died in a federal prison, i.e., he was probably on to something. Another problem area among Marxists is the assumption that matriarchal society, where it existed, occurred only at very low stages of production and under only primitive conditions. This assumption echoes the generalized linearity and chauvinism of Western history, which tends to see all other cultures other in space or in time as mere preliminary stages on the way toward modern development, or as sadly failed attempts to achieve the freeway and the ball bearing. In fact, the evidence shows that some of the most advanced societies of the ancient world, technologically as well as culturally advanced, was matrifocal, i.e., woman oriented and led by women. The early Cretans were worshippers of the goddess, and Cretan women were priestesses, judges, doctors, artisans, athletes, business entrepreneurs, cultural leaders on all levels. Crete was the major cultural and trading center of its day, with ships traveling to Ireland, Spain, Africa, and the Near East for gold and tin. One of the things exported was the Cretan lineal script, whose syllabary was then passed on through the Greeks to the Phoenicians. At home, the Cretans had indoor baths with hot and cold water running through ceramic pipes. Cretan plumbing in 1700 BC was far superior to anything achieved in Europe until well after 1700 AD. The graceful and artistic Etruscans were all matriarchal, and so were the early Egyptians. Traces of matriarchy existed in Egypt down through the later empires and dynasties. In these cultures, as in many others, the family group lived on land that belonged collectively to the mothers. A woman's husband or lover lived with the woman and her kin group. Children, regardless of the father's identity or legal relation, lived with the mother's family group. Ancient Egyptian law clearly designated that all family property, land, and household goods belonged to the woman, and that she, married or unmarried, had total disposition of her own belongings, including herself. No one studying the Cretans, Etruscans, or Egyptians could refer to these cultures as primitive. Very advanced cultures were also developed by the matriarchal Dahomey and Ashanti peoples of West Africa and by the Naya people of Kerala in southern India. Among Native Americans, it is largely the metrofocality of the Pueblo people that has allowed them to endure so long in their old ways, with strong architectural technologies developed among them. The dwelling places of all these people, from portable grass huts to multi storied apartment buildings, were not simply maintained by women, women built them everywhere. Home site technology was originally seen as woman's province. We're not saying that matriarchy was a system in which the women went around ruling everyone with a big stick. Matriarchies are not built on dominance principles, but on the facts of blood kinship, including the primacy of the mother. Women own their bodies, their children, and their living properties. Women made vital decisions affecting the survival and well being of their people. There was no way by which an elite group of men could set up laws to restrict women's movements, ideas, or sexual activities. Economic relations were not experienced as separate from religious and social relationships. They were originally based on gift exchange, which served a communal bonding function, not a competitive or profit making one. Material goods had value only in terms of the social or spiritual uses to which they were put. Guys, if Marxists tend to underrate ancient matrifocal cultures as primitive and underdeveloped, this is only because Marxists share Western prejudices about development. They are assuming that all cultures, ancient and modern, are to be judged according to how close they come to approximating the industrial factory system with its quantitative production regardless of the life quality of the cultures being evaluated. In this prejudice, Marxists and stock market men seem to share equally. Here is quickly it's a picture, and the name of it is Women of the Third World, painted by Monica Shu. This is Women of the Third World. Um, I'm gonna go for, I'd say we're close. I'm gonna go for 15 more minutes and then I'll stop there. I'm gonna go into the original Black mother. Okay. It is possible that the religious ideas of ancient Crete and Egypt originated in Black Africa. During 7,000 to 6,000 BC, the Sahara was a rich and fertile land, and a great civilization flourished there. Images of the horned goddess, who became Isis of Egypt, have been found in caves on a now inaccessible plateau in the center of what is now the Sahara Desert. When the earlier fertile land dried out, probably as a result of climatic change, the people spread out from this center. And wherever they settled, they brought with them the religion of the Black Goddess, the great mother of Africa. Great importance has always been given to the Queen Mother across the continent of Africa. The original Black Goddess was regarded as bisexual, the instrument of her own fertility. She was the ancient witch who carried a snake in her belly. Africans worshipped her many manifestations. The creator of the gods of Dahomey, for example, was Mawu Lisa, imaged as a serpent. Mawu Lisa was both female and male, self fertilizing, seen as the earth and the rainbow. Africans believe that the earth is ultimately more powerful than the sky and its gods. The sky can withhold rain, but earth is the source of the life force itself. The Gaia hypothesis of modern environmental science confirms this ancient concept. The sky, with all its dramatic life giving movement, is in fact created by the earth. The envelope of air and moisture surrounding us is really the earth's breathing. As in the ancient African beliefs, the sky gods are creations of the Mother Earth. She breathes them out and can breathe them back in. Great work needs to be done in the study of indigenous African mythologies and religious beliefs, especially in linking these with the development of other world religions. For just as physical humankind probably began in Africa, so no doubt did our concepts and images of the sacred originate there. One Black historian who has investigated the African origins of Egyptian, Mediterranean, and Near Eastern religions, including Christianity, is John G. Jackson. Though his 1972 work on African origins of world culture is titled Man, God, and Civilization, Jackson fully acknowledges the matriarchal origins and influences of African society. He quotes Lewis H. Morgan, Sir James G. Frazer, and Robert Briffault, and points out that their investigations of early group marriage and also of the primacy of lunar based religions throughout the world are confirmed by early African matrifocal cultures. I just want to go back to one point where it says the original Black goddess was regarded as bisexual, the instrument of her own fertility. Right there, we're talking about before there. It is science. Just so you guys know, it's scientifically proven that woman did not at one point way back. I'm not sure how many years ago, but you can do your research. That woman could actually self fertilize at one point. in time. So there's that. Just wanted to point that out. And when they were speaking about the belly in or the serpent in the belly, they're speaking of about a the prana or life force within our body. They call it the kundalini energy sometimes. I won't go too far, but I just want you to already begin to be thinking that these are scientific or biological terms that are being laid out and will be further discussed as we go on. But okay, so back to where we were. So he quotes, we're talking about John G. Jackson, who wrote Man, God, and Civilization. John G. Jackson quotes Lewis Morgan, Sir James Fraser, and Robert Breffault, and points out that their investigations of early group marriage and also of the primacy of lunar based religions throughout the world are confirmed by early African matrifocal cultures. Not only the royal families of Egypt were matriarchal, but also all the common people. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, circa 100 BC, wrote of the Egyptians: among private citizens, the husband, by the terms of the marriage agreement, appertains to the wife, and it is stipulated between them that the man shall obey the woman in all things. As Jackson notes, these customs seem strange to the Greeks, but they were normal features of African societies. Jackson has devoted his life's work to pointing out that these ancient African societies were neither primitive, baby, neither primitive nor undeveloped, but formed the creative cradle of the world. For example, of early technologies, remains of graded roads and cultivation terraces are found throughout Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, and there are megalithic structures in West Africa. In the opinion of many anthropologists, including Franz Boas, iron smelting originated in Central Africa. The ancient people of Mashonaland in Zimbabwe were extensive miners and iron workers. Herodotus reported that iron tools were used in building the Egyptian pyramids, and these tools were mined and smelted in Africa. Another example is writing. Sir Wallace Budge, renowned Egyptian scholar, believed it was clear that Egyptian hieroglyphs derived from symbols used by native Africans on painted pots and boat banners. And we must add that the poetry painters and banner makers were women. In fact, the legendary Atlantis could have been West Africa. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus referred to the Western Ethiopians as Atlanteans. Trade, between 6th century BC. If y'all don't know anything about the Atlanteans, they were an extremely advanced society. I'll just say that. Okay, so trade between 6th century BC Phoenicians and Ethiopians living on an Atlantic island called Cerne, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, is recorded. Leo Frobenius, the great 20th century archaeological explorer of Africa, was convinced that Atlantis had been located on the West African coast in Yoruba land. He found remains of great palaces and statues and heard the Yoruba people recount legends of an ancient royal city and its palace with golden walls. That's Atlantis, which in the past sank beneath the waves. Frobenius concluded that Yoruba, with its channeled network of lakes on the coast and the reaches of the Niger, Yoruba, whose peculiarities are not inadequately depicted in the Platonic account, this Yoruba, I assert, is Atlantis, the home of Poseidon's territory, the sea god by them named Olokun, the land of peoples of whom Solon declared they had even extended their lordship over Egypt and Tyrene. Frobenius also saw links, physical and cultural, between the West African Yorubans and the culture of the Mayans in the Mayans in Central America. In the book Africa and the Discovery of America, Harvard professor Leo Weiner also traced this African Mayan connection, finding documented evidence that in pre Columbian times, West African mariners and traders made over 50 voyages across the Atlantic to Central America. This connection would explain the clearly the I'm sorry, this connection would explain the early Olmec statuary found in the Veracruz region of Mexico with its clearly negroid features and also the legend that Mayan glyphs were originated by the Olmecs. In connection with ancient West African mariners, it's also interesting to note that, according to Irish historical legends, the Celtic island was invaded and dominated for a time by sea rovers from northwest Africa's called Fomorians. And on the other side of Europe, in India, evidence shows that the early inhabitants of India, the Dravidians, were black Africans with Ethiopoid figures. These Dravidians founded the first Indian civilization in the Indus Valley with large cities, two-story brick houses, bathrooms with drains leading to brick sewers under the streets. The Dravidians were extremely skilled in iron technology. A Dravidian made column of welded iron in a temple courtyard in Delhi has stood for over 4,000 years without showing any rust. The renowned Damascus blades were made of this Dravidian iron. And once again, the pictographic script of 200 signs used by these 4th century BC Dravidians is almost identical to that found carved in the ruins of Easter Island, 2,000 miles west of Chile in the Pacific Ocean. All of this far flung evidence supports the probability that the ancient Africans were global mariners, traders, and settlers sailing both west and east, the Atlantic and the Pacific, and spreading their advanced culture everywhere like seeds. And we must remember that this was a matriarchal culture. A matriarchal culture. Yeah. Boom. Boom. I don't know if y'all caught that. What all these scholars of Africa and their data are telling us is that human development does not proceed in a straight line from the primitive to the advanced. Nothing in nature proceeds in straight lines, but in circles. And human cultures, too, like individual human beings, go through cycles of development and regression. Empires do rise and fall, and cultures that now appear primitive or never developed could well be sitting on the rubble of great past civilizations, once built by their ancestors, once flourishing and then disintegrating under a multitude of pressures. This point is important for women investigating the past existence of matriarchies, as well as for students of ancient African glories, for the same patterns apply to both. The contemporary Western world, ruled by an essentially white patriarchal elite, sees itself as the peak of human development. In its linear view, all past cultures were by nature inferior, simply because they came earlier in time and existed mainly not on their own right or in their own terms, but as mere steps on a grand stairway leading up to the supreme white Western maledom. This linear developmental process is rarely questioned and no more than white male dominant. Oh, I'm sorry. This linear developmental process is rarely questioned, no more than white male dominance is questioned. In the official view, it just comes from God or derives from Newton and the internal combustion engine. Confronted with evidence from archaeology, anthropology, mythology, strange dreams, of the existence of great past cultures, whether of Black Africans or of Central American Mayas or of Mediterranean matriarchies, for example, in Anatolia, Crete, Malta, Etruria. The historical tendency of white patriarchy has been absolutely to deny these early cultures and mock their evidence. Or, if they can't be denied, to treat them with chauvinistic contempt as some form of lavish barbarism. And the detractors quickly rushed to point out that these early cultures, despite their aesthetic and spiritual qualities, were limited in technology, like they didn't have smog or home computers, or they practiced human sacrifice as though 20th century Western civilizations don't, or some other stigma of inferiority, which always adds up to saying they weren't us. No, they weren't. But they were viable cultures within their own terms. And because they were earlier in time, most of the arts, crafts, technologies, and religious insights we boast about were invented by them. When historians like John G. Jackson point out that many contemporary African village people live among the ruins of ancient graded roads, farm terraces, iron smelters, and megalithic monuments, which they no longer use or not even know how to construct, they are referring to a phenomenon known as cultural regression, like going backward. People can go backward in cultural and intellectual development as as well as forward, as any student of the European Dark Ages can testify. Backwards or forwards, the movement is always along a spiral, not a straight line. Many factors can be responsible for such regression, including climate change, environmental damage from new technologies, like i.e., cattle grazing that help create deserts, and internal cultural change. By all accounts, the major cause of cultural regression during the past 2,000 years has been political invasion and the cultural colonialism that follows. The invaders try to destroy the existing social forms by force and punitive colonial practices and attempt to impose their own cultural and religious patterns on the conquered. Culture is a people's own vision of themselves in relation to the world, created by themselves through a blood continuity of time and space. Political invasion via cultural colonialism weakens the creative will of the conquered by destroying the people's coherent vision of themselves. Guns, police, and the invaders' law help in this process, but imposition of alien cultural symbols and religious ideas are the most effective tools. Listen, in the imposing of alien or like foreign cultural symbols and religious ideas, the imposing of these things are the most effective tools in the long run for obliterating or distorting a people's self image because they are aimed at the most intimate parts of human beings, sex and spirit. By the time European and Arabic slave traders and colonial invaders reached Africa, that continent's great period of cultural development and extension had peaked. But the matriarchal social patterns, at least along the West Coast, were still intact, and the people still worshipped black goddesses with bisexual powers and still participated in the cyclic processes of Mother Earth as a sacred year cycle ritual. And it was these matrifocal social and kinship patterns and these goddess oriented spiritual participations that the colonialist invaders had to break in order to impose imperialist domination and exploitative slavery on the people. Wherever Islam or Christianity impinged on the life of the Africans, it was introduced by the invaders in whose interest it was to detach the local inhabitants from the dependency on the rules of behavior demanded by our agricultural and seasonal change. This pattern, the paradigm of the patriarchal imperialism, we find repeated again and again throughout the world, in Africa, in Asia, in South and North America. What many people don't realize is that the same pattern was successfully imposed by Imperial Rome on its colony, Europe, at the beginning of the Christian era, a process we will investigate in part four. To break up the ancient maternal kinship groupings and the sacred life patterns they followed for the purpose of robbing the native people of their land, stealing the earth's raw resources, and exploiting human labor, the colonial armies sent the missionaries in to introduce the abstract and alien concepts of father right. Remember, we've been talking about mother rights and her property and all of the matriarchal institutions. Well, here comes the missionaries introducing the alien concepts of the father's rights and a father God who was the enemy of the great mother. Christian missionaries preaching of the heavenly father and his son, and Muslims carrying the message of Allah and his prophet Muhammad performed the same colonizing functions. They found the mother's people who were alive and well within the holistic now, and they denounced these people's ways and redefined them as backward children of a distant, aloof, paternalistic power. All exploitation, all exploitation follows quite easily and self-righteously from such a redefinition. Colonialist powers really convince themselves that they are doing their victims a favor, lifting them up from Mother Earth through whips, degradations, imprisonments, hunger, and slaughter, so they can glimpse through tears a far off shining palace, the abode of the Heavenly Father, the exploiting home country. Imperialist colonialism always sees itself officially as an instrument of spiritual enlightenment. What this means in practice is that the mother, the people's blood identity, the people's blood identity is denounced in the name of some superior father God who always happens to live somewhere else. Because in maternal cultures, the father is a social rather than a biological role. And because this father role is defined in terms of its relation to the mother, i.e., it is her brother or uncle, this enforced redefinition brutally attempts to pull the ontological rug out from under all basic social relationships and the emotions surrounding them. We must consider the effects of this. In some matriarchal cultures, such as the pre Aryan Toda people of India, who practice polyandry, a woman will choose one among her many husbands to be a social father for her child. The more common practice is for the mother's brother to act as social father. In these arrangements, the man acting as father must win the children's affection and respect. He cannot expect it as his right. He protects and cherishes the children among some people, receiving them into his arms when they are born. But they are not his in the sense that he is seen to have had a share in their physical procreation. Among most preliterate people, as among the ancient Paleolithic and Neolithic peoples, the man's role in procreation is seen as one of opening the womb. But it is believed that children are placed in the mother's womb by spirits, perhaps the returning spirits of dead kin. The man cannot relate to the children as his property, in other words. They come from the mother, through the mother, and belong to the spirit world. I'll read one more. There are fewer emotional conflicts in such cultures. Okay. There are fewer emotional conflicts in such cultures. The neurosis producing, ego festering hothouse atmosphere of the Victorian type nuclear family is entirely avoided. After spending early childhood close to the mother's body, the young child then moves out into the group's life guided by the social father. The child belongs to the whole people and feels this belonging. Because he does not relate egoistically or possessively to the children, the social father is much better prepared to let his own nurturing talents develop truly. There is no question of property right, personal ambition, economic responsibility, sexual jealousy, or social status involved in his relationship to women and children. These cultures are not perfect, but the notorious soap opera of Western domestic life is avoided. Most of all, these matrifocal cultures weave a web work of non possessive intergroup relationships, which supports a growing being through every phase and crisis of unfolding life. And lastly, colonialism tries to rip this network apart with the artillery fire of patriarchal concepts, concepts of women's inferiority, of misogynistic and anti sex morality, of possessive fatherhood, of competitive greed and alienated individualism, and of women, children, and land existing as the property of dominant males. A major rip involves splitting the human spirit away from the Mother Earth and her cyclic processes and forcibly reattaching this surrendered spirit to the sky, i.e., to some aloof and abstract source of dominance and power. A result of all this is the destruction of a people's blood memory, its past identity, especially since colonized people tend to keep oral histories and patriarchy insists that only written history is real. Okay, so I think that is a good stopping point. And I am going to take this last few minutes to